driving south from Montana. Some beautiful landscape. I'm not driving. I have my co-pilot here. It's been an interesting week. The last video about explaining what fascism is and what is not draw some attention to some people. That brought me some memories, and it's harder for me to believe that after these many years there are still people pushing for communism, using the exact same arguments, the exact same ideas that they did when I was in school, even before that. One thing I didn't mention in that video is that it's not like in Argentina those ideas were just theoretical. There were actually guerrilla type terrorists that were trying to overtake the government when I was a baby, and then we had a military coup that dealt with them with the exact same violence. So it was awful, but that's what communism is about. So one of the things in that video that I created was that I was accused of not knowing, not understanding Karl Marx. And my argument is that nobody can understand it because it makes no sense. That doesn't mean that intellectually I can't see what he's saying, and that's why I say it makes no sense. So the example that I put is, in the comments was like, oh, let's say that the universe is, is made of tiny rubber springs. So now let's, shape the economy, the society, everything around that concept. You say, well, that's nonsense. But then we say, oh, then you don't know what a rubber spring is and how it works. I do, but it doesn't make any sense because that's not connected to reality in any way, shape, or form. So that's the same thing. It's not like I cannot understand. I didn't understand what Marx was saying. I think that he was just making no sense. See, his philosophy and his view of the world was based on nonsense. So something that it's interesting is that in Spanish we don't have this phrase or an equivalent phrase to going down the rabbit hole. And what I'm going to do in this video is hopefully prevent you from going down a very disgusting rabbit hole, but if you want to, feel free to do it. And I've forgotten most of what I learned back in the day, mostly on purpose because I don't want that stupidity taking place on my brain. But unfortunately, I still remember some of the concepts. So I'll try to explain. If there's any errors, also remember that I learned these things in Spanish, translating mostly from German, some from French. So yeah, could be weird. I might not know the exact way things are said in English. But let me start with a personal story. When I was probably 23, 24, I was working in the university in geographic information systems. The group that we were there, we would go to have lunch together. And during those lunches, people would mostly talk, especially on Mondays, would talk about soccer and what happened throughout the Sunday. Now, I always enjoyed playing soccer, even though I was never really good at it, but I really didn't follow the teams, right, the clubs. So, what? Sorry. much because the reflection of the sun was disturbing the driver. So soccer was the topic, and they would talk about the players, and the statistics, and in which club they played before, and so on. And I really had no idea, so I felt kind of excluded, and many times, my positions about things were dismissed because of my ignorance. So I started kind of studying it and trying to memorize, okay, who played here, who played there, and try to. And then I realized I don't care. If they want their life to be about soccer, good for them. I don't need to participate. So, I suddenly stopped talking about things. Let them discuss or whatever. I just had my food. But that's when I really learned that sometimes it's useless to try to learn stuff. And that's kind of the problem with socialism, communism, fascism, Nazism, all these theories. There's so many different holes inside that rabbit hole, and they take you nowhere, right? Well, like I said, they take you to a big, steamy pool of crap. And if you want to go there, it's up to you. But let me tell you some of the things that I remember and explain why don't they make any sense. I hope it's obvious why they don't. But, many of these things go all the way back to the Greeks, mostly to Plato. Right? And the Greeks were all about, I think that Paul says in the Bible, that they were all about just learning something, hearing something new. It didn't matter if it was good or if it was true, it had to be new. And that kind of been the main tenet of philosophy since then, right? You only get famous if you do something new. And, that newness leads to very ridiculous ideas. But one of the people I remember that kind of gave Marx the tools was Hegel. And Hegel wrote a lot. Another piece of trivia about myself, I read a lot of philosophy during some time where I worked in Buenos Aires while I lived in La Plata, and I had to commute. It was a long commute. I was fairly poor, so the only books I could afford were used books. For whatever reason, those philosophy books were really, really cheap, so I could get a lot of them and I could read them during those commutes. So I remember that during that time, I was probably 26, 27, when I started reading Hegel. And the main concept that I remember from him was this idea of the dialectic. And Hegel was about, how ideas get developed, how ideas grow, how they get, better, things like that. And why dialectics? Well, if you think about the word, it's the same root of dialogue. Right? And then again, it could go all the way back to, the Greek philosophers, and how through reason and discussion you could find truth, which is not a bad idea, but, well, depends how you implement it. But, Hegel proposed this idea of you have a thesis, right? Something that you're proposing, and then you have an opposite idea to your idea that he called the antithesis. I don't know if he's the one who came up with those terms. I remember, him associated to them, but so you have the thesis and the antithesis. So two ideas that are opposed. Now that creates a conflict, And they also had this idea of change. Change is what was important. Again, going back to the idea of the Greeks, what was it? Heraclitus that said, you can't, a man cannot swim in the same river because it's not the same river and it's not the same man, or whatever, right? Oh, mind blowing. But this idea that ideas needed to change, and the value was in the change of the ideas. So now you have your thesis and your antithesis. Eventually, they both collapse and they disappear, and then you have a synthesis, right? That is a new idea. That is not the first one, it's not the second one, and it's not even a compromise. This is not about compromise or finding common ground. It's about things disappearing and new things appearing that basically are, the basis for this progress, for this change. Now, okay, good. If that happens, that's nice. Now you have a better idea than the two previous ones. But no, that's not the end of it, because that synthesis becomes the new thesis, right? And now somehow you have a new antithesis, something that opposes to that previous synthesis, now thesis. So now those two need to collapse and become a new synthesis, and so on. Where does it end? Well, illumination, whatever. So Hegel, if I recall correctly, he was an idealistic, not in the sense that we use idealistic now, but in the sense that this is all about ideas, right? The world of ideas. Again, going back to Plato, Aristotle, and whatever, right? So these ideas that collapse, disappear, and suddenly you have a better idea. Okay, if that's the way you want to see the world, good for you. I don't see it. I don't see that happening. But in all this philosophy, what they did, well, first of all, they didn't feel the need to justify any of that, right? Because this is not about proving. You cannot prove a philosophy. You just accept it. In a sense, it's a religious movement. Okay, this is how I'm going to see the world. Right? They also had these other ideas about, well, the reality that we're perceiving is not the real reality, and there's this fake God who took who created this reality to have us trapped here, so he becomes our God, and it's called the demiurge or something like that. I don't know. I always, when I read the demiurge, for whatever reason, I see him as the Grinch. I don't know why that connection happens in my mind, but yeah, it's if you worship God, the God of the Old or the New Testament, or the Christian God or the Jewish God, then you're actually worshiping the demiurge, because the real God is somewhere there trying to have us awake, from this reality. A lot of crazy idea. I mean, good for a religion. If you want to have a religion that says that, be my guest. My own religion is criticized for our beliefs, and that's good. Perfect. But when you try to shape your society, your economic systems, and everything based on those that have zero grounds on reality, well, you'll have consequences. And we'll hopefully going to talk about the consequences later. But, so, what is the difference? Well, Marx kind of liked that idea of the dialectic, the synthesis, antithesis, so thesis, antithesis, and synthesis, but he didn't like the idea of the idealism, so he called them materialism, right? So, what's the name in English? Materialist dialectic? I don't know. What is the difference? The difference is that there's nothing there. There's no demiurge. There's nothing. There's just reality. So the material reality. So we are just atoms. organized in a certain way, but still you had this core belief in the progress, and in flow and in movement. So instead of thinking about ideas, what Marx did was he applied this to economics, right, and to basically how society works. And his claim was that this thesis, antithesis, synthesis will happen until you reach socialism. Why? Just because. Right? So that's kind of the top of the pyramid. Does it look like or ring a bell about multi-level marketing or Ponzi schemes? Well, it kind of is. Why? Because let's say that we accept this idea that, well, that's how things happen, that's how things progress. You can't predict where things will go. I mean, that's a funny thing for me about people who follow Marx, that they believe, there's this conflict, this struggle that has to be resolved, and usually is by something, like a revolution, and then you have something better, and then that happens again, and you have something better. Like, it's always these tiny explosions, tiny revolutions. But the thing that claim that where all these things will land, well, that's kind of, I have a problem with that, because that makes you a prophet, right? And if you want to follow Karl Marx as a prophet, be my guest, but let's call him what it is, right? So, what is the problem with materialism, and especially with this materialism that claims that they know where things will end? Well, they don't need individuality. Humans are not important. You're just a bunch of atoms. You're just some cells, a clump of cells. Does it ring a bell? And if you're opposing to the unavoidable future, you should be eliminated. Why not? There's no soul, there's no heaven, there's no God, there's no morals, there's no nothing. It's just you are impeding progress. That's why communists and all the socialist experiments killed millions of people that opposed to that idea, because they were just clumps of cells that had to be destroyed so the beautiful change will happen, right? And funny thing is that they kill people on purpose to have those changes happening, and then they kill people just by implementing those ideas by accident, let's say, by famine, by other means. So communism doesn't work. It's ridiculous. Yeah, you could say that you understand it, but you cannot claim that it makes any sense. So why does it have this appeal, especially to young people? Well, because young people, they need to find their place in society, and there's a couple of things happening at the same time. When youth go to college, principally, it's the first time that they are alone. They're not under the influence of their parents, and they really have this need to, define themselves and being, different than their parents. Their parents, usually they're productive members of society. That's how they survived. So they try to find problems with that. Problems with how society works, and it gives them a sense of self-importance to, I'm going to be part of this great movement where, we're going to bring, equality, and we're going to bring happiness to everybody and the workers, and, all these movements also need an enemy. So they abandon the demiurge, so they need to replace it with something material. So they make up an enemy. Like I was talking in the previous video. It could be rich people, powerful people, could be some other race, could be whatever. But it's, if you hear somebody talking about them and us, well, probably it comes from this idea. And again, this whole idea of thesis and antithesis. So in Europe, all these ideas were flourishing. Everybody needed to come with the new one and build, on top of others. So there were many didn't survive because they were, well, as ridiculous as this one, but for whatever reason, this one survived and are still alive. I can understand why. But in United States had its own set of bad ideas. So let's just put this out of the way. But for instance, the whole eugenics idea that Hitler believed in, well, he took it from the United States. Luckily, the United States grew out of it. But when in Europe all these movements were happening, United States look at those and basically say, I don't care, let's just use our time wisely and let's build a country. and so, well, in Europe, you have fascism, Nazism, communism, and people killing each other, and in the name of these crazy philosophies, then United States became what it is today. So it's so sad now to see people, especially the youth, not knowing anything about history, not knowing anything, and just taking whatever they give them to make them feel important. I was arguing that nobody really understands Marx because there's nothing to be understood. You basically need to ascribe to his beliefs, repeat them, and suddenly you are accepted. You're part of the group, you're part of the movement, and yeah, you can now go and kill people, right, that are opposing to the revolution, the historic forces, the forces of history that basically are predefined because everything is material. Religion is the worst thing that could happen because religion gives you a sense of individual value. You're created in the image of God, so you're not just a bunch of cells. You are important. You have a purpose. You need to help other people. So that's why communism, the first thing that it does is destroys religion, right? And socialism as well. But that's kind of in a nutshell what it is. So I was saying about socialism and all its flavors, how they need to have an enemy, and capitalism does not. Capitalism never has an enemy. It's just, can I make business with you? So if you disagree with somebody, you're basically just looking for opportunities to do business with them. Right? And yeah, capitalism could be cold and could be selfish, but it's not intrinsic. And maybe some other time we can talk a little more about what capitalism is. But you could be completely altruistic and selfless and still be a capitalist. I could make $1 million and then decide to give it all to other people. It's my money. It's my freedom. I can do whatever I want. Right? If I want to keep it, well, that's a defect of my personality. But that doesn't have to do with it. So capitalism doesn't require you to be that way. And funny enough, if you look at the biggest donors for charities or for whatever, they're never the socialists. Never, ever. They're always the capitalists. So apparently these evil, greedy people are more willing to give of what they're rightfully theirs than people who believe that, the government is the one who has to solve the problem. The way they justify is that, well, it's not for the individual to solve the problems. It's not the individual to give to charity. It's the is the collective, and since the collective doesn't exist, it's the government, right? The government is a representation, supposedly, of the collective. Okay, I think I covered a lot. I don't know, I want to think that these are parts of the big puzzle. So we need to understand how people are manipulated. We need to understand bad ideas, and to understand, well, how to avoid them, how to learn from them, how to teach other people, and that's why I stand firmly by my claim that Charlie Kirk was the biggest, the greatest anti-fascist, anti-communist, anti-Nazi of our time. So, well, I hope you learned something. Please, again, don't take me. I've been trying to forget the thing for a long time. I might have made some mistakes. I have mentioned the wrong name, the wrong